So one of the things I just realised could be a little bit touchy, and I've asked about salmon farming. So I just wanted to know whether we should just not talk about that because it is a political issue.
Look, so in terms of the salmon farming stuff, we have been working with human aquaculture. They've been interested to know about growing giant kelp in the vicinity of their pens. It's quite interesting, the whole link to the salmon stuff, Amanda, because what we found quite interesting is that when we've been out there and we've got 3 sites where we're working with humans. So one of those sites is right adjacent some pens with fish in it, and then the other 2 sites are in what we call a fallow lease. So in other words, they've got a lease area there, but there's no fish there. So it's kind of far away. It's in the same area in Storm Bay, but it's sufficiently far away from the pens that do have fish to have minimal, impact from that. So what we've done is that we're growing kelp at the site where the salmon pens are, and we're growing kelp at the site where the salmon pens are not. And at the site where there aren't any salmon pens, we've got 2 treatments. We've just got one treatment where the kelps are just grown in the water as per normal, and at the other treatment, we're actually hanging little bags of fertiliser on the line, slow release osmocote, basically. So we hang these little bags of fertiliser on the line to provide an additional source of nitrogen. So one of the issues for growing kelp in most Australian waters, not everywhere, but most places where kelp grows, and particularly now on the east coast with this increased influence of the East Australian current water, is insufficient nutrient. In the old days, decades ago, when the east coast of Tasmania was much more influenced by subantarctic water masses, and East Australian current water was kind of a rare event in eastern Tasmania. Not only was the water colder, but it contained far more nutrient. So the kelp forests really thrived. Now with climate change and the whole shift in the ocean environment, the east coast of Tasmania is warming at about 4 times, just under 4 times the global average, so this 95 or greater than 95% loss of giant kelp forests, those big forests that form those floating platforms up on the water surface, floating canopies, and they were such an iconic part of the Tasmanian coast, forever. Well, over 95% of that's gone, and that's due largely to this direct response to the warming. So the warming is really driving the loss of the giant kelp forests, but then it comes with the double whammy that the East Australian current water, which is the warm water that's coming here, is also very, very low in nutrients. So that's why we had that nutrient perspective on that experiment with human aquaculture. So what we did was we grow up microscopic kelp on thin pieces of string, and then we wrap that string around some of the infrastructure on the salmon pens, or on the infrastructure away from the salmon pens where there was no fish. So the same kelps went out at the same time on the same infrastructure at the same depth in those 3 different treatments, and they were microscopic when they go out. It just looks like, all you can see is it kind of looks like a bit of a brown scuzzy string. So 12 months after that initial deployment, last November, we went back to have a look at all of those sites, and the kelps adjacent to the fish were about 10 metres long. So they've grown about 10 metres in that year. The ones in the fallow site with no added nutrients were only 2 or 3 metres high. So in other words, there's a massive difference in growth, indicating the different access to nutrient. And the ones at the fallow site swinging that we grew next to the bags of slow release osmocote, they were sort of intermediate between those 2 extremes. So that tells us a couple of things. It certainly points to the importance of the nutrient and the fact that the eastern Tasmanian waters now are very low in nutrient, and we get much better kelp if we provide nitrogen. So the nitrogen in this case was coming, basically it's coming from the fish pens, with all of the food that goes in there, and that food gets eaten and pooed out and that by the fish, and that provides the nitrogen. The interesting thing for us is that when we're out there working and taking the measurements of the kelp, we also take water samples. And then we've got really sensitive instrumentation to measure the nitrogen content of the water. And when you measure the nitrogen content of the water in the samples all the samples that we've taken, it's near zero, and there's no real difference in the nitrogen that we see in terms of the standing concentration if it's taken adjacent to the fish pens versus at those other places in that fallowed site without any fish. It's still extremely low, nitrogen. So that's pretty interesting, and what that's telling us, it's much more to do with the flux of nitrogen, the rate at which nitrogen is being delivered to the system, rather than the actual standing concentration. Because if there was no difference, the other possibility is that if there is a little peak in nitrogen associated with the fish pens, it might just be associated with the feeding, or because presumably the defecation of the fish is linked to when they feed, and they only feed them at dawn and at dusk. So it could be that there's a little spike we might see in the water column. But the interesting thing is, overall, that there's no evidence of those fish farms there providing enough nutrient to actually raise the concentration of nutrients in that offshore site where, there's a fair bit of current flow and all that sort of thing. So it all seems to be dispersing pretty quickly. Nonetheless, it's made a huge difference to the growth of the kelp. Those 10-metre long kelps are just magnificent. They're really in good shape. And all that in 12 months, compared to these stunted little 2-metre things at the site without the fish. So that's the full story really around the link with the aquaculture. I would strongly encourage you to talk to Huon Aquaculture about where they want to go with this. So where we want to go with this is to really work towards commercial production of kelp, if you like, on offshore farms. So there's two reasons for going offshore. One is we want to actually move away from contested real estate. The marine real estate in sheltered bays is also in very high demand for recreational amenity. The boaties and the fishing people, and people don't want to. And just from an eyesore point of view, not that all kelp farming, unlike salmon farming, all the infrastructure is underwater, so you don't see anything other than a few buoys. Nonetheless, people don't want to see, big marine farms happening in their backyard. So that contested real estate issue is something that we're aware of. But the real reason for needing to go offshore to grow kelp in commercial quantity is this nutrient problem. So if we go out and start growing kelp in 100 metres of water, rather than in 20 metres of water, in a little sheltered bay somewhere, by the time you get down to about 100 metres, the water down there has much higher levels of nitrogen. So what you can do is you can draw that nitrogen up with a wave-driven pump, just pull it up in a pipe, and then disperse it, irrigate the kelps at the surface with that nutrient-rich water. To get we're just beginning this research now. We have to do a whole lot of work on the engineering side, because those offshore environments are really tough places to work. Even at the Storm Bay site where we're working with Huon, there were two 10-metre, in fact, one 11-metre wave event last winter. So that infrastructure's got to deal with 11-metre waves, with all the drag on it with kelp, and, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of engineering work that we need to do to enable people to work offshore safely. and economically, make it economically feasible. But there's also a lot of science that we need to do. Not that we'll be bringing up that much water in the grand scheme of things, but we have to be squeaky clean to make sure that that's not going to have any environmental impact, adverse environmental impact. So there's a whole whack of, small pilot scale stuff that we need to do first, so that we can have the data that addresses these questions of, if there is any impact, what might it look like? Are we going to get phytoplankton blooms? Blah, 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 blah. So what we need to do is to go out and run some very small scale empirical experiments where we bring some water up from depth, and then we use that to inform, quite sophisticated models where we would then model the effect of, a full scale farm, 10 or 100 hectares of, growing kelp. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why we should think about growing kelp commercially. The demand for kelp products globally, is absolutely skyrocketing, and many people argue now that demand is outstripping supply, and it's used for all sorts of things. Kelp products, alginate is the primary extract that happens at the moment commercially, but there's a whole lot of other stuff to come out. So alginate's used in cosmetics, it's used in food, it's a food thickener. Most beers that have that really nice, big, heavy, frothy head on them, the reason that you get that heavy, frothy head is because of the alginate that they put in the beer. Alginate's used for most people don't realise that they're either putting alginate on their skin or eating it or drinking it at some stage of most days.
Yeah. That's I've never heard of that either. So that's that's so interesting.
Yeah, so there's even for the known stuff. But look, kelp is a superfood. It's has 90 something trace elements. These micronutrients that are so good for health. Very high in protein. Some species are known to be really super effective as immune system boosting. Mm-hmm. There's a reason that Japanese women have the lowest rates of breast cancer anywhere in the world. Again, that's been linked back to seaweed diet. Southeast Asia has known about the health benefits of eating seaweeds, including kelp, for centuries. So in the US, mostly in the trendy restaurants, I wouldn't say it's mainstream yet, but we're seeing massive increase in the uptake of kelp, being introduced into diet. So that should happen in the Western world more and more as we understand that. But kelps are also now being used as, they're developing bioplastics from kelp. I'm involved in a research project for that. So those kelp bioplastics, potentially it's looking very positive as a really good solution for the problem of single-use plastics, because a kelp-based bioplastic, will break down in a few weeks, and if a fish or a seabird or a mammal, eats it, if it ends up in the ocean, they're just going to digest it and poo it out. It's not going to hurt them. In fact, they'll gain energy from it. So, there's all sorts of reasons why people globally are focusing more and more on growing kelp and other seaweeds. Mm-hmm. And in fact, seaweed, growing, and that industry's tiny in Australia. So that's one of the reasons why there's a thing that I've been involved in called the Marine Bioproducts Cooperative Research Centre, or the MBCRC. That's a research centre application that's being led out of Flinders University. But that's attracted over about $70 million of external investment from, private industry in cash, to develop marine bioproducts, and a really big chunk of that story. And overall, that CRC is about a $270 million project that will run over 10 years. And a very significant part of that is focused very much on seaweeds. So, there's all sorts of benefits that I've just been talking about with that. So there's a lot of interest in the space, basically, is the short answer, as to why we might want to be thinking about this. In terms of food production, one of the reasons to be thinking about seaweeds, it's not just the health benefits, but of course the productivity of seaweeds is just massive. So the kelps that we're focusing on are amongst the fastest growing photosynthetic organisms on Earth.
They talked about growing kelp. Well, during my research, if you reforested the oceans, it would create more potential, just like trees are converting our CO2 or creating all that oxygen.
Of course.
If we started to farm, and also, is there an opportunity not to just farm, but to also repopulate the?
There is. So let me get to that. So the advantages of farming kelp, other than the benefit of having that as a product, and I mean, as I said, one of them is just the massive production rates, and of course, the rate of production is directly limited to the rate of carbon capture or carbon drawdown, right? So the healthy kelp forest produces more per square metre of seafloor than per year than the most intensely managed terrestrial agricultural system. The production rates are absolutely fantastic. So that means the carbon capture rates are absolutely fantastic. So, but the real question is, what is the fate of that carbon? If that carbon, it's whether the carbon gets broken down by microorganisms and therefore respired again as CO2. It's not the real issue is not just it's not just how much carbon you can fix out of the water, because what happens is the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, as the CO2 in the atmosphere builds up, more of it dissolves into the seawater, and that's why we're getting acidification of seawater. But then the kelp takes up that dissolved CO2 just in the same way that land plants take up CO2 and produces oxygen. So the kelps are very, very good at taking up carbon, for sure. But then it's what you do with that kelp then. So what some people are saying is, well, what we should be doing is, because kelp grows so quickly, we should be growing heaps of it and then sinking it to the bottom of the ocean and taking that carbon out of the carbon cycle for the next few centuries. But if the kelp just washes up on the beach, for example, then all the organisms will degrade it and eat it and respire it. If we eat kelp, yes, some of that carbon goes into our structural, into our body, in terms of the carbon that makes up us as individuals. But a lot of that also then ends up being respired as carbon dioxide as we breathe out, back into the atmosphere. So you've got to really make sure that, and most people don't understand the difference between carbon capture and carbon sequestration, which is, you capture the carbon initially through photosynthesis, but then the fate of that carbon determines whether it's actually sequestered, in the long term. So one way to sequester things in the long term is to have it buried in the sediment at the bottom of the ocean, where it just lies there as kelp and doesn't break down for a long time, for centuries. So that way, if you like, it becomes a carbon sink. So some people have suggested we should be doing that. I think, and maybe when the price on carbon goes up a bit, it might be worth doing that. I don't know. I think that's all a bit theoretical at the moment. What we do know is that there's just a demand for carbon products, for kelp products, and some of that carbon, one of the issues with Australian soils, for example, is that it's too low on carbon. A lot of Australian soils, you can pour nutrients onto them, but they won't grow anything much because they're so carbon poor. Well, very, very small amounts of seaweed can really boost the carbon stocks in soil, and that's another way. So that's a way of having soils pick up that carbon, using kelp as a fertilizer. Put carbon back into soils and bring productivity back into these sort of ancient depauperate Australian soils. So again, that would be a way of capturing a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that carbon that would be produced by the kelps. So there's all sorts of ways to ensure that the carbon that kelps capture end up being sequestered in some way, rather than just going back and being converted back to carbon dioxide. So there's a good news environmental story around that. The other good news environmental stories around kelp really are the fact that you don't have to pour chemicals on them to grow them.
Mm.
You don't have to use tons of fertilizer in the way that happens in terrestrial systems. You don't have to bulldoze more habitat to grow it, and you don't have to pour fresh water on it. So habitat and fresh water are increasingly valuable commodities, and not needing to use those to grow a really valuable product is a great story. Basically, the environmental outcomes around kelp farms are really, really positive. Kelp cleans up the water. You don't need to pour all these chemicals on it. You don't need to pour fresh water into it. So the environmental outcomes from growing kelp, even in a farming context, is fantastic. The other thing, of course, is that as soon as you put the kelp there, you're going to start finding all that production, all that new habitat. There'll be more and more fish. That gives you the option of doing the permaculture thing, where you harvest not just the kelp, but the fish that then become associated with that. So there's all sorts of benefits from doing this. Now, going back to your earlier question is, what about restoration of kelp beds? So I mentioned a couple of things there. One of the problems with species like the giant kelp, I said 95% of the forests in Tasmania have gone. Certainly in eastern Tasmania, but we recently did a study looking at satellite images of surfaced kelp, and I can send you that paper if you like. But that wasn't just eastern Tasmania. That was all of Tasmania, and we looked at it from about the mid 1980s to about 1986 to about 2016, over that period. And it showed the same thing. It showed that the giant kelp forests that are remaining is just a tiny fraction of what there used to be around Tasmania. So one of the issues, of course, is, well, you don't just grow kelp and put it back out there because the water's still warm. You haven't fixed the problem. One of the interesting things is, if you go back to these areas where there used to be these big forests, the forests have gone, but you do find a scattering of giant kelp left in these areas. And those kelp actually look physiologically in good condition. So that is suggesting that they're actually coping with this warmer water, much better than most of the population, which suggests that those particular genotypes are tolerant of warm water. So what we've done is we've gone to populations all up and down the East Coast, and we've gone to these areas where the kelp's gone, but the forests are gone, but there's still some kelps remaining. And we've taken the spores from those kelps and grown them up in the lab, and then subjected them to experiments where we subject them to warm water. And then, so we grew about 50 family lines from these different kelps that we'd selected from the wild. And now we're finding that among those 50 family lines, there's 5 or 6 there that are particularly tolerant to warm water. In fact, they seem to be surviving in water that at temperatures that I never thought was possible. So that's a good news story, that there are some genotypes there that seem to be doing, they seem to cope quite well with warm water. So what we're suggesting is that any attempts at restoration, any attempts at growing kelp for commercial purposes on these offshore kelp farms, we should be using those genotypes to future-proof the industry and to future-proof those kelps. Now, let's just assume that we do get all the technology right and we get the engineering problems sorted out, and we can grow modules, with really dense populations of giant kelp, for harvest. Our idea is that by making the farm modular, we'd be able to unclip a module and tow that module into sheltered bays where there used to be lots of kelp. At the time of peak spore production, so that we saturation bomb those reefs once more with the spores from giant kelp. And that's probably one of the most exciting potential ways of restoring kelp beds at any sort of scale. So that's where there's a strong link between growing the kelp for commercial production and the conservation side of things, which is around restoring some of these kelp beds in areas where they used to be, but no longer occur. So the benefit to the farmer of that is that, of course, the big risk for kelp farms that are growing in an offshore environment are those winter storms. So if they can unclip, 20 or 30 or 50% of their farm in smaller modules and tow those and anchor them over kelp forests in the wintertime, which is when the spore production is at its peak, there's enough nutrient inshore in winter to support those farms. They don't need to be drawing water up from depth and irrigating. So the nutrients will be okay for the kelps. The risk of damage from storms will be much lower because you'll position these on sheltered reefs, in sheltered bays and things around the coastline. So that helps to mitigate the risk for the kelp farmer. And then number 3, of course, is you get the benefit of all of those, trillions of spores being produced there, and saturating those native reefs, and hopefully helping to restore the giant kelp in the area where it used to be and is no longer.
Well, that's just great. So it actually sounds like, it's consuming all our nutrients, so nutrient-rich from the salmon farms. So that seems to be one major bonus. And that's also happening from land. If we're having a lot of nutrients coming off land, then that will also be helping the kelp grow, and it's also helping our oceans because it's converting these high nutrients that wouldn't have anywhere to go. Am I on the right path?
Well, so in terms of, there obviously are local areas of high nutrients from anthropogenic sources. That's true, but in general, the waters around Australia are nutrient poor. There's a couple of areas where you get local upwelling, deep water that's nutrient rich at depth gets brought up to the surface with various oceanographic mechanisms. But very little of Australia has any upwelling. So in general, at any sort of scale, the problem for growing kelps in Australia is that there's not enough nutrient.
Okay. And then that's this warming as well. So, and this is a global issue, the warming thing. So what do we need to do there? Is there anything that you believe that you see that we could do better that will help?
So there's 2 things. So in the cases of things like giant kelp, giant kelp was largely restricted to Tasmania and small parts of Victoria and South Australia. It's not the widespread kelp species. The kelp species that's most widespread, sometimes called the golden kelp, it's a thing called a Clonia radiata, and that's the single most important kelp species in Australia. And it goes from up the West Australian coast, right along the south coast of Australia, around Tassie, and up to the New South Wales Queensland border. So that kelp is it's certainly better adapted to warmer water, although we've been losing it in a number of places for various reasons. So the giant kelp story is kind of a very particular one. It's a very specific issue that is directly related to the warming, and really all we can do there is try and identify the genotypes, the family types that are better adapted to tolerating the warm water, and making sure that they become the more predominant genotypes. Now that will reduce genetic diversity, which has its own problems, but at least we've still got some kelp. So so that's kind of the reasoning behind why we've gone down gone down that route, to try and identify and grow and promulgate those warm tolerant family lines. We're not doing any gene manipulation or anything like that. We're just identifying from the wild those particular strains, if you like, of kelp that are tolerant, and then grabbing those and growing them up and using, making sure that they become, more dominant.
So with the loss of our kelp forests, if we've lost 95% of them, would that be contributing to the warming or the lack of nutrients or the...
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, look, the giant kelp was never... There are many species of kelps, and the giant kelp, which is the one that's where we've lost 95% of the forests. So again, there's a few subtleties here, Amanda. The giant kelp was never that widely distributed, and it's really, the really sort of strong point of its habitat was Tasmania, in Australia, around Tassie. As I said, it does occur in patches in Victoria and South Australia as well, but the real stronghold of its distribution was Tasmania. So it is not the most important kelp in Australia by any means, but it is the iconic species that forms those really dense surface canopies, right up, floating on the surface. So those seaweeds they're attached to the sea floor. They'll go up through 10, 20, 30, 35 metres of water column and form those canopies up on the surface. That's a very special habitat type. And when I talk about the loss of the forests of those giant kelps, it's those dense forests that are gone. And as I said, if you go back to those places, not everywhere, but many places, there'll be individuals still there. There'll be an individual, kelp, here and another one over there and another one there. But generally, the forest itself is gone. There's just a few remnant individuals left. So, and over 95% of those forests have gone. In fact, this is the giant kelp forests is the first marine community type to be declared as an endangered marine community through the federal EPBC Act. And that happened 2012, I think is right. But that doesn't mean that other kelps aren't there. Other kelps are there. So back to your question, what can we do about it? What we do know is that climate change is not the only pressure on kelp. So warming and low nutrients is not the only pressures that are coming on kelp. So what we're seeing with one of the indirect effects of climate change is that in some parts of the country, tropical fish are changing their distribution. And there's a group of tropical fish called rabbit fishes that are really voracious herbivores. And there's a couple of spots towards the northern part of the range where rabbit fishes have moved in, and those rabbit fishes have overgrazed kelps. There are other areas where we know that the kelps have been subject to poor water quality. So there have been water quality issues in Port Phillip Bay. There have been water quality issues adjacent to Adelaide. That looks very likely to have driven loss of kelps in those areas. So sea urchins, overgrazing by sea urchins as sea urchin populations have built up, have been another significant threat to kelp. So in terms of what we do know, if we really want to ameliorate the effects of climate change, if we can minimise all these other pressures that we can control locally, we at least give the kelps a fighting chance to deal with the climate change. If you have climate change plus all of these other local things, water quality issues, urchins, blah blah blah, then you're much more likely to lose those kelps. So one thing you can do is to really clean up your act locally. We're not going to change the behaviour of the East Australian current by anything that we do in Australia.
And what do you reckon cleaning up our act locally would be? Like, does that mean we need to change our farming practice to be more organic and more sustainable? Do we need to, because I think a lot of the damage is also a lot to do with the soil runoff. So if we do a lot of, I know when we built our house, there was a lot of excavation on our block. And so we have a creek that goes straight down to the ocean. So there was a period there for a year or two that there was a lot of dirt moving through our property out to the ocean. Yeah, what is it that we can do on the land that will help?
Anything that's going to help maintain high water quality in the ocean. So, minimise pollution, minimise sedimentation. Kelps thrive in clear, nutrient-rich, cold water. And then the other thing that we can do to help, of course, is, as I said earlier, is to identify these, in terms of the response to climate change, is to identify these warm-tolerant family lines. Mm-hmm. And then see if they can then be the basis of conservation efforts and the basis of commercial production of kelps.
So when do you think that we might be able to see some commercial production of kelp?
Well, we've got some research applications in now to be working on the research, some of the early research to move towards that. If the Marine Bioproducts Cooperative Research Centre is funded, and we'll know that in the next couple of months, then that will be an enormous boost in conducting the research. That will lead to that. But look, I think more and more people, Amanda, are recognising that commercial kelp production could get to the same sort of scale that salmon aquaculture is now, but without all of the environmental issues. So, perceived or otherwise. So, I suspect there'll be a much stronger social license for growing kelp when people recognise that the water quality will actually improve with the more kelp we grow, and that by growing kelp will reduce habitat destruction on land, and the fact that it doesn't require artificial chemicals and fresh water and all that sort of stuff. People will begin to understand not just the benefits of growing kelp in terms of the product, the health outcomes and all that kind of stuff, but also that the environmental outcomes, are also very positive. I mean, really the only major impact is going to be that some of the offshore real estate is going to be taken up with farming. But the offshore real estate is so vast, it might mean that shipping tracks might have to, move slightly or something. But, in the grand scheme of things, those sorts of issues are far outweighed by the benefits, of doing this. So we just have to be, cleverer about, how we approach doing it. So the Norwegians are looking at repurposing their old oil rigs and other offshore infrastructure for growing kelps. We're seeing a massive expansion of kelp production up in Alaskan waters where the nutrients are much higher. It's fantastic conditions for growing kelp. So it's not just Australia. There are many other nations that are actually ahead of us as they're exploring ways to manage growing kelps offshore.
Okay, and we're talking about more common, not the giant kelp. Like this is a particular kelp that grows here in southern Australia. Giant
kelp grows right around the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. So those big giant kelp probably the Californian giant kelp communities are the ones that are best known because they're sort of most photographed and filmed, and you go to social media or mainstream media. If there's anything to do with temperate marine areas, there'll be always a shot of a Californian kelp forest somewhere. It's the same species that grows here. So, it's right across the northern Pacific in the temperate areas, as well as the southern hemisphere. So there's a lot of interest in giant kelp, not just in Australia but elsewhere.
Okay.
in terms of its commercial production. They're producing it commercially in Chile now. It's happening, but at a relatively small scale. The Japanese kelp, that is an introduced species here in Tasmania. It's a thing called Undaria. That's the Latin name, Undaria pinnatifida. You'll know it as wakame. It's used. Wakame is used in. It's the kelp that is typically in miso soup and in many other Japanese foods. It grows fantastically quickly. It's very valuable as a food product. Work from University of Hawaii has demonstrated wakame to be super effective at boosting immune systems. So that's another possibility. I mean, people are growing wakame, Undaria wakame, not just in Southeast Asia but in other parts of the world as well. So there'll be, I suspect they'll end up with a handful of kelp species that will be the main focus of development. But the common kelp here in Australia, the Eclonia radiata, sometimes referred to as the golden kelp, it's certainly the common kelp. It's a much smaller kelp. It only grows to about a metre high, metre or so. There's certainly potential, great potential for that as an aquaculture species, as a farm species as well. So what we don't want to be doing is ripping all this stuff out of the environment. We don't want to be harvesting the native populations. Kelp is harvested in Tasmania, but it's up at King Island, but it's only collected from the stuff that washes up on the beach in storms. No one's allowed to go and cut it if it while it's growing still attached. So after a big storm, a whole whack of kelp will come up on the beach, and that's the basic resource for that industry that operates out of King Island. And demand for that product far exceeds their capacity to supply it. If they could double the amount of stuff came up on the beach in the storms, that the King Island kelp industry could still sell it all.
Wow. I was also going to ask, so the natural habitat, what animals are living in that? I thought it was the sea dragon. What other?
Oh, there's an enormous variety of fish, invertebrates. Abalone thrive in kelp forests. In fact, they're dependent on seaweeds of some form. The abalone don't eat the kelp per se, or not much anyway. But they're certainly abundant in healthy kelp forests. And then there's all the tiny little critters that are part of the food chain leading up to fish. When kelp forest, it's that huge rates of production. So the primary production is really high, and that supports the production in the rest of the food chain that sits above it, the food web that sits above that. So production is high, but also in providing all of that complex physical habitat, that also attracts a lot of organisms. It's a bit like you put an artificial reef out, suddenly you'll have a lot more fish. Right? It's not because they can eat old tyres or cars or whatever you've made your artificial reef out of. It's because of all of that physical complexity and heterogeneity that you have, in putting that structure in the water. So kelp, of course, is it's a complex three-dimensional structure. Not only provides food, it provides habitat, physical habitat. So the bottom line is, it's we call kelps foundation species. As soon as you put a bunch of kelp in the water, you end up with a whole lot of other things very quickly. And we've done this in experiments. We had an experiment that ran off Maria Island here in Tasmania, where we put out 28 artificial reefs of different sizes, and we put them out over about 1.6 hectares, well separated from each other on a sandy bottom. And the only thing we put onto those reefs, we transplanted adult kelp from other sites. And we put the kelp there in different densities. And as soon as the kelp was there in natural densities, it was absolutely astonishing what turned up. We don't even know where some of that stuff came from, because the nearest kelp beds, on natural reef, was about 2 kilometres away. And yet as soon as we transplanted those kelps, very, very shortly afterwards, this whole slew of other species came in. Now, some of it came through on the plankton, which settled on the reefs and grew, metamorphosed and grew into those organisms. But, there was also stuff there that must have come there by, swimming there or moving there in other ways, transported there in other ways. So, those reefs were soon crawling with juvenile crayfish. There were endangered pipefish that were there. A big diversity of fish, a big diversity of molluscs, a big diversity of invertebrates of all sorts, and a big diversity of other seaweeds. And it really, we knew it would happen. It took us by surprise how quickly it happened, and how diverse those little artificial reef patches became. So, the kelp beds really, the kelp really provides, if you like, the infrastructure for the rest of the community to be there. But it is a good news story, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
For your time.
Thanks. Cheers.
Okay, bye.